Welcome everyone. This is all about unlocking performance post-lockdown, and we're going to talk to you today about creating more marketing value with less budget. And joining me in this webinar is going to be Darren Woolley, who's going to be the main contributor. So I'm sure you all know about Darren and the many posts from TrinityP3 that he's been active with, and we're here to help. So let me just take you through a few of the housekeeping aspects so that we can all understand what the basic rules are. And once again, thanks for joining us. This is going to be 1 hour long, and you can ask a question at any time through the Q&A function. And helping with that Q&A function will be one of my colleagues, Nathan Hodges. So put your questions through on the Q&A, and he'll raise them to Darren as we go through. Now, you can either allow yourself to be anonymous with that, or you can put your name to it. It's up to you. And what we're really doing is we're joining with you and really sort of embracing the problems we're going through as part of the economic impact of COVID-19 and what the pandemic means to organizations. Because really what we're seeing is few are going to avoid having cash resource issues. And with those cash resource issues, you're going to find that support for marketing activities could well be impacted. And looking beyond simply just further cutting costs, how can marketing and procurement maximize the value of the marketing budget? So this is what the webinar is all about. And I'm going to hand over to Darren, who will take you through some thinking on this.
Thanks, Julian. I'm sure none of us are sitting here thinking that the world at the moment is like we knew it to be as little as 3 months ago. In fact, if you just look at the headlines, and I know I'm spending more time online than I've ever done before, working remotely, but things like, the pandemic sees brands rapidly recasting marketing plans Asia-wide. We've seen marketers cutting budgets already, freezing campaigns, postponing campaigns, and also a shift from traditional media to digital and social campaigns being reported widely as marketers are trying to reach people in their homes as they're self-isolating and social distancing. So there's a huge shift, and we've been through shifts before. There was a major global recession only 13 years ago, but this is quite different. It's had a profound difference because it's all about global health and it's life-threatening. And so it's also impacting the whole world. So we're seeing changes, and I think the word unprecedented it gets used a lot, but in many ways, this has not happened this way in living memory. So it's no wonder that people are scrambling around looking for what should I be doing now? What we want to talk about is not just about what you should be doing now, but the opportunities now to start thinking about the next 3 months, the next 6 months, and even longer of how the world will look. There's some research out of DigiDay, which has said 73% of ad buyers have clients pausing spending. Our own research says that that's about right. It's about 70 to 80% of marketers are actually at the moment pausing their spend. Now, this is not universal across every category because, of course, there are some categories which have been profoundly impacted. Like, for instance, travel, hospitality, restaurants, entertainment, all of these have been absolutely decimated by the health requirements of isolating and the reduction of travel. However, there are other categories that are booming. It's a boom time for grocery. It's a boom time for a lot of retail. It's a boom time for cleaning and personal care products as people are finding themselves isolated at home and needing to invest in and more of their spend in that. The other thing is that marketers, having got over the original shock, I guess, of the impact that this is having on the world, because it happened really quickly. You've got to remember that it was only Chinese New Year where the news broke globally. And here we are now 2-3 months later, And it's a very different place, very different marketplace. 65, Gartner says 65% of CMOs are preparing for budget cuts. Our own polling showed that around 70% of marketers were saying that they will not have the money, the budgets that they thought they would have for 2020. And they're also seeing this as being a medium term, 6, 12 months or more of an impact. Whereas interestingly, the agencies were talking 3 to 6 months. So there's a bit of a disconnect there, but I think now everyone's starting to see that this is going to certainly have an impact for the foreseeable future. Of course, the other thing is, the economy at the end of 2019 was already fragile. There was, very low growth in most markets. There was issues around oil prices and also exchange rates for many economies. But we've also seen a huge slump in consumer confidence. In fact, it's dropped to levels not seen since the last recession. And of course, it's very easy for people to sit there and try and compare the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impact with the global recession that we had in 2007, 2008. But in actual fact, they're quite different. And they're quite different because one is about an economic recession. This is actually a recession brought about by a huge health crisis. And so, yes, consumer confidence levels plummeted, but I think it's also going to drive us into a recession off the back of this. That even when we start to be able to have more social freedoms, be able to travel or at least get out of home and go back to work in offices, we're going to still see tough economic times. So what that actually means for everyone is, the thing that we have to be aware of is, of course, there's lots of people, and this is Mark Ritson, but he's not alone. There's a lot of voices saying, well, a recession's the best time for marketers to be upping, not cutting their budgets. Now, of course, even Mark will admit that that is if you have cash. And I saw in the trade press, P&G were saying that they're actually doubling down on their marketing spend. But that's off the back of increased sales as people are increasing their hygiene, personal hygiene with hand washing, but also personal care at home. So of course they're going to invest, but there are going to be a lot of categories where they don't have the money to double down. And if you can't double down and you want to stay in the marketplace, what does that actually mean for you? And I think it's going to be a big challenge, not just for the next few months, but probably going into 2021 and beyond. So the foreseeable future for marketing is doing even more with less. And we've been doing that since 2007, 2008. There's been a constant downward pressure on media, on agency fees, because we've seen marketing budgets in many cases on average either maintain or in real terms fall behind inflation in most markets. But this has become even more paramount, that we'll need to find ways of doing more with less. Now, how do we go about that? Well, if we remember back to 2007, 2008, and I remember it quite well, TrinityP3 was 7, 8 years in business, and we had marketers coming to us with the belief that the reality that they needed to cut their budget by 30%. And they were wondering how they could achieve their marketing objectives with 30% less money. At the time, in most cases, they were able to go to their agencies who were willing to take on the amount of work for 30% less. And that's led to this. This is what we call SMUs and MSMUs. What this is a measure of productivity within the agencies, and it's tracking or plotting based on Michael Farmer in the US has been tracking this for creative agencies since around 1995. We've been doing this for media agencies since around 2005. And what you can see is that the price per productivity output of both creative agencies and media agencies has significantly decreased over the last 15 to 20 years. This is a reflection of the downward pressure on agencies to produce more for less, because it's not just about a fee for service, it's a fee in relation to what the agencies were actually producing. So we can see there on the left, the SMU, which is the creative productivity score, has dropped significantly from around 400,000 in the late 90s down to around 132,000. Likewise, for media, back in 2007, it was up at around 215,000, 220,000. It's dropped down to around about 95,000. So there's significant drops in cost per SMU, which is a cost per unit of output. So the next question, can we actually get agencies to be more productive? Well, if we look at the number of SMUs per creative, so this is the number of outputs produced by creatives, each creative FTE, we can see since 92, where the average agency creative was producing around just over 2 SMUs. Today, they're producing around over 5.5, almost 6 SMUs. What does that mean? It means that each resource is producing a lot more outputs. So agencies are actually working more productively than ever before. So at a time when the cost per output was dropping for agency fees, the number of outputs the agency was producing was increasing. Now, you would have to say that if you just went back to your agency and said, well, we want you to produce the same amount of work for less money, or increase the amount that you produce with less resources, you're going to be pushing these numbers even further. It's a really interesting observation that, you know, many of the problems that the industry has had and been widely reported, especially in the last decade, is actually driven by this. In fact, in Michael's book, Madison Avenue Manslaughter, he actually spells out most of the implications, the juniorizing of agency staff, the long hours that agency staff are working, the high turnover of staff are all the symptoms and the consequences of this trend. Having agencies produce more for less money is actually driving these numbers. Now, is that sustainable? It was only a few years ago that we saw in APAC a number of agencies that reported having staff die from overwork. This is not a sustainable industry. And one of the reasons that the amount of outputs has increased is that Michael himself kept a track of the typical number of outputs on a brand, went in 1995 from around 150 to 250 outputs per year. Today, it's closer to 3,000 to 5,000 outputs per brand per year. Now, anyone working in agencies will tell you that that will primarily be driven by the increased investment in digital and social media channels, where there's a big consumption of content. You know, instead of producing one TV ad for a year of broadcast, many advertisers are now not just producing one video or TV commercial, but they'll be producing hundreds, if not thousands of versions of digital display and social media updates for each of their brands. So we've had an exponential growth in the number of outputs. We've had a decrease in the fees paid to agencies for producing those outputs in real terms. And agencies have got to the point where they're producing the maximum amount, the highest level of productivity, but it's all been showing that it's unsustainable because they're not keeping up with the demand. So what can we do? What is it that we can actually do when we're faced with having to produce even more for less going forward? Well, the fact of the matter is it's time to prioritise. This is a prioritisation matrix. These are very common. You know, What's the priority? What's the business impact? You know, high priority, low impact. So it's a high priority, low impact. What sort of resources should I be putting behind it compared to high priority, high impact? And then if it's low priority, low impact, should I even be doing it at all? These prioritization matrix gives you a way to be able to actually filter through and prioritize the work that's being put through marketing, or that marketing is being asked to produce, so that you can focus on investing your money and investing your time and resources into the areas with the most impact and also the most priority. We've been doing a very similar process with our clients for over a decade, in that we've been helping marketers that are simply running out of resources, both time and money, to use a prioritization filter to actually start to control and prioritize and invest in the areas where they will have the most impact to meet their strategic needs. So what does that look like? We talk about it as being a tiered brand or product or service approach. What we have is two axes here: strategic importance from low to high, and then financial investment or ROI from low to high. So anything that has a low ROI and a low strategic importance, we'd call tier 3. These are the things that you would have to consider whether they're worth actually doing. And if they are, how do you minimize either the resources or the financial investment in those areas? The things that have a high strategic importance and a high return on investment are tier 1. These are the things that you would prioritize and actually make sure that you're putting your best resources and your financial support behind, because they're going to either move you forward strategically or move you forward financially. Now, it's a really interesting approach, because while a lot of people will talk to us about, now when we introduce this idea of a priority matrix, they'll say to us, especially the CMO will be sitting there, and they'll say, well, we do that anyway. In our budgeting process, you know, we will have a higher budget for our high strategic and important brands, and we'll have a budget for a smaller budget for our lower or less important brands, for instance. But when we often then started talking to the brand managers, because they don't have that big view. So a brand manager on a tier 3 brand, one that's not that strategically important. And in one case, it was because it was actually a declining brand. It was being supported to support the decline. Yes, they understood that they got a smaller budget, but when they went to spend it with the agency, they were paying the same sorts of levels for the cost of those productions and the agency fees that the tier 1 brand was paying. And when we talked to the agency, I remember the conversation with the account director and the head of production. And they said, well, it takes us the same amount of time to produce a TV ad for this brand as it does for this brand. So why wouldn't we need the client to pay the same amount? Well, it doesn't make sense, because that's on a time and cost basis, which is where the agencies are working at. But if you're working on an investment and value basis, would you spend the same amount of money on a tier 3 brand to do the same work as you would on a tier 1 brand? Because largely that's often what's happening. Even though the tier 3 brand may have a smaller overall budget, the fact is that without this prioritization matrix, all of the work will go through the same agency as if it's either tier 1 or tier 2. And it's not just about prioritizing the brand or product or service. You can also apply this on a project basis or even on a channel basis. For instance, you could prioritize certain channels because they have a high strategic importance. For instance, you know, if you're looking at brand and driving brand saliency, you may say that things like video, whether it's TV or online video, has a greater strategic importance than a channel such as digital display ads, which are more possibly being used more tactically. So that you would then start to prioritize the work around a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, based on the financial importance and the strategic importance. The other thing I like it personally about this is that the strategic importance could be a number of things. And increasingly in the world, we're seeing other strategic issues beyond just brand growth, such as environmental sustainability, social responsibility. These are also filters that can be built into this prioritization process. These are considerations that could help you start to prioritize not just where the brands sit, but also where the particular project sits or where a particular channel sits as far as the priority you're giving it, and therefore the level of investment of both money and resources sits. So what we do here, for instance, we have done work not just for consumer packaged goods clients, but we've done work for banks and telcos and the like, where they only have one brand. So it's not about tiering a brand because the brand is the brand. But what we've done is actually applied the tiering to the type of project or marketing project or campaign that we're actually working on. So a tier 1 would be a campaign that could be high strategic importance because it's a large brand building piece of exercise, but it also could be tier 1 if it's got a high financial investment or return on investment. So you can see that the tier 1, 2, and 3 is not a cookie cutter approach, but gives you a framework that allows you to think about the different activities you do. Whereas tier 2 may be, for instance, acquisition, and tier 3 could be all of those things that you put through your business as usual. You know, the EDMs, the types of things that are more about just the execution of the campaign rather than either driving the strategy or a return on investment. Now, how does that translate? How does this prioritization matrix translate into the way you manage your supply chain? And for those that are not procurement people, when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about the service providers that are working with you to deliver the marketing. So we talk about, again, a 3-tiered approach. At the very top level are your strategic partners. These are the agencies and companies that are actually engaged to drive your strategic requirements. So it could be research, brand tracking. It could be research, or it could be brand agency. And so these are all at tier 1, and they sit at tier 1 because their contribution is significantly important from a strategic point of view. Tier 2 are your specialist service providers. These are the agencies or companies that have very specialist skills. And often they'll be, for instance, digital agency, it could be SEO or SEM, it could be your PR, it could be your events company, that they have skills in a particular specialist area, but they're not actually driving or informing the strategic direction. Their role is more to come up with the specific specialist execution of the campaign or the plan with those specialist skills. And then tier 3 are more your general service providers. Now, some of those may straddle one or two tiers. It may be, you know, for instance, you may have an in-house agency that is generally a general service provider in that largely its job is to take campaign materials or assets and repurpose them for delivery. But then they may have particular specialist service skills that are also provided in-house. So in that case, it would sit across tier 2 and tier 3. What we're inclined to see, though, is situations where the lead creative agency will be seen as a strategic partner, it'll be seen as a specialist service provider, and it's often providing general services as well. And one of the areas is that it will then have a rate card or a remuneration model that means that the agency is being paid the same amount for all 3 of those areas. It's like going to a gourmet restaurant and asking them to whip you up some fish and chips. They'll be beautiful fish and chips, but they may be very expensive for what they are. And so what this is about is looking at your marketing supply chain, looking at your agency roster, looking at all of the service providers. And I mentioned it a moment ago, not just your external service providers, but also your internal service providers. You know, many companies are starting to build in-house production, in-house agency, in-house design. You need to consider them as part of your supply chain, even though they're inside your organization. So how does the two work? Well, one is you've gone through a prioritization process where instead of each job coming out of marketing, given a priority one, you're starting to look at it from the point of view of, be it the brand or product or service or the campaign or project or even the channels, are prioritized as to whether they are tier 1, tier 2 or tier 3. The next thing is you can then use that to actually start giving the work to the particular tier of agency and remunerate them based on the strategic importance and the financial performance of your prioritization matrix. So let me give you an example. You've got a new brand positioning or a new brand communication that you want to put out. You would develop that with your strategic partner. But when it comes to the actual execution across multiple channels, it may be that you are using more of the sort of executions, the sort of more commoditized executions into things like you know, your social media updates and the like. You're looking for either a tier 2 or a tier 3 partner to actually execute that. Now, you could actually have all of that done by the tier 1 strategic partner if they have the capabilities. But the thing is, you would then start to have to rethink the way you're paying them, because at the moment, you'd usually be paying your tier 1 agencies a tier 1 premium. Likewise, you'd be paying your tier 2 a tier 2 level of remuneration, and your tier 3 would be often quite heavily discounted because of the level that they're producing at. So how would you go about that? And that's where we talk about applying a tiered output rate card. Now, I know this looks incredibly busy, but let me take you through the sort of elements of this to actually explain what we're talking about. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing is a detailed, and this is just a small section, a detailed description of all of the outputs that they have with the creative agency. Then as we move across, there's origination, then there's refresh extension, then there's complex adaptation and simple adaptation. This is what is the work that's required. Are we originating something from start? Are we refreshing it or extending an existing campaign or existing strategy and extending that with a new execution? Are we taking existing work and doing a complex adaptation? And this is really important for those global brands that are often producing work globally and then putting them into individual markets. And it's a big issue, especially across APAC. So is it a complex adaptation of that global work, or is it a simple adaptation? Then we go even further down, because in this particular case, the client didn't want to call it tier 1, 2, and 3, but actually put here hero work, push work, and acquire work. And what that means is hero work was the types of projects that would make the brand a hero, whether it was brand building or whether it was simply product innovation or service innovation. Push is for acquisition, and then push was to push products and services into the market, and then acquire was more the acquisition at the, a good example would be bottom of the funnel, getting the conversions into the brand, into the business. Now, what you would see if you have a close look, and look, these numbers are not the actual numbers. I've changed them for this presentation, but you know, there is a difference in the fee paid to the agency depending on the type of work it is and whether it is hero, push or acquire. So that's what, this is an approach that allows you to not just think about prioritising your work as far as the way you treat it and the agency you give it to, but it also impacts the fee that you would be paying to the agency for doing that work. And in many cases, it will often reflect budgets that are actually set for each of those types of work. But what it does is it allows, for instance, a major agency to not just treat every single project as a hero project, but to actually understand the value that that project represents, whether it's a piece of origination or it's a complex adaptation, and whether it's going to be a hero piece of work or an acquired piece of work, because it impacts directly on the fee paid to the agency. So this is a way of not just taking, we're going from the prioritization matrix to the marketing supply chain and prioritizing that, and then actually having an impact on the fee paid for the different types of work. And we're actually agreeing this up front with each of the agencies so that moving forward, we can actually invest to the level that's justified by the strategic and financial requirements of the particular piece of marketing work. Now, if you want proof, here's an example. If you had 100 jobs that you typically paid, and I've made these numbers nice and easy, and it's based on real client outcomes. But if you had 100 jobs, so 100 outputs, and you were paying $1 million currently, and then you started to look and prioritize the work and realize that only 30 of those were really tier 1 type projects, why 40 of them were tier 2 and actually 30 of them were tier 3, it's still 100 projects. But the amount that would be paid to the agency would be $800,000. Because what it's doing is it's actually valuing the work based on the strategic and financial importance of each of those particular outputs. Likewise, and in fact, it's interesting because when we start working with brands, and we've done this right across APAC, we've even done it globally. When we start working with brands, many marketers and their agencies will think that most of the work that they do is tier 1 brand building. But in actual fact, what we'll find is around 10% of the investment is going into pure brand building. Most of it will be going into tier 2 and tier 3 type expenditure. And if we look at that profile, 10 projects at tier 1, 30 projects at tier 2, and 60 projects at tier 3, we're seeing that the fee would be around $700,000. So that's a 30% increase in buying power just purely by aligning the importance of the job to the agency that's going to be doing that work to a fee pre-agreed to do the work. Now, let's say, and all the evidence is suggesting that perhaps you're not operating at all the work at tier 1. What happens if all of the work you're paying your agency at is actually at tier 2? And your complaint is that the quality of that work is not up to scratch. Then if you went back to a 30-40-30, you would actually start seeing an increased investment in tier 1. And so it would net out at the same, but you would have a very good argument for holding the agency accountable for why they're not producing the high quality work at tier 1. And you would still save money with the typical, and around 10%, with the typical format that we see of 10-30-60. So if that's not evidence of how this approach can actually deliver you real buying power, I don't know what is. because this is not even taking into consideration the number of projects that your very initial prioritisation may eliminate even from being requested from the agency. If you use and implement a prioritisation matrix, it means that marketing is in a position to be able to actually eliminate those projects that have low strategic requirement and low financial return on investment. So by way of summary, marketing is in a position more than ever, and after more than a decade of downward pressure on budgets and downward pressure on agency fees. So we've seen the supply chain to do more with less. We've seen the supply chain has been squeezed. Agencies and suppliers are being squeezed. So what we're recommending is applying a prioritisation matrix to your brands, if you've got multiple brands, to your products and services, if you've got one brand but multiple products and services, to individual projects, and to the specific outputs that the agency is producing. And then aligning the suppliers, aligning your agencies, both and suppliers internally and externally. Think about your in-house agency if you're using that. Think about your small design studios and your small agencies that are also often on your roster, and actually formulating a framework that allows you to get the right people doing the right work at the right cost across your whole project of work. Because if you are like the majority of marketers, where in the last 15 to 20 years, you've gone from producing 150 outputs, and an output could be, you know, one Facebook update, to now producing 3,000 to 5,000, the economies of that scale can have a huge impact on the way that you actually invest your money and what you get to buy with it. So now there's time for Q&A. Julian?
I'll jump in here actually, Darren. It's Nathan here.
Yep.
So we're waiting for some questions. Anybody who's got any questions or any comments or anything like that, just pop them up. I'll be reading them out here, but I've got one to kick off with here, Darren, straight away. So you talked here about a change from input-based thinking to output-based thinking on the parts of marketers and also on the parts of agencies on a marketer's roster. In your experience, what are the barriers, the common barriers that you've encountered to adopting that way of thinking?
Okay, look, it's a good question. And the first one is marketers are often in a difficult position of complaining sometimes about the quality and the cost of their agency, but at the same time, unsure how to actually manage the workflow, manage the projects that they're briefing the agency in this way. So that they feel that if they move away, for instance, from retainers or project fees to this output value-based model, that somehow the agency, they'll end up either worse off or that the agency will be worse off. Yeah. The agency side, the biggest difference for the agency is to realise that they're not just charging for head hours, that they're actually producing outputs to the client's requirement, and that it's up to them to manage the head hours. So what we've seen often is when we implement this, and we've done this across a large number of clients and agencies, is that the resistance, first of all, is the agency wants to be paid for the number of hours they do. This model doesn't pay them that way. This pays them for the work that they produce. And so that's a huge leap. From the client side, they also like having many of them will like having a team, agency team, sitting there and not really worried about productivity. But the fact is that productivity has become a bigger issue now. When you're trying to do more with less, productivity is your only way forward, because cutting the agency fee, it's been cut to the bone and the system is failing.
Thanks, Darren. So we've got a question here from Lindsay. And Lindsay's asking you, how do you quantify tiers 1 to 3 agencies? What differentiates them?
Well, it will depend on the client and their strategic needs. So in some ways, we've seen tier 1 agencies be a data analytics company. So it'll be a tier 1 because that's strategically important to that client. Then within all of the data agency companies, we will then quantify them based on their capabilities and often their underlying perceived value or real value in financial terms. So, sorry, yeah.
So you're saying it's about making sure that you match the agency capabilities to the actual strategic requirements of the advertiser or the marketer?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole purpose. You know, most people go about running pitches, for instance, to find agencies that they get along with, which is terrific. You know, you should work with people that you have good alignment on value and culture. But in actual fact, you're appointing an agency to fulfill specific needs that you have as a marketer. And that will vary from marketer to marketer and brand to brand. And so this is about aligning and categorizing the agencies specifically for the needs of that client.
Mal Dale's got a question here, and he's asking you whether you're saying that the pips have been squeezed out of the marketing supply chain, and that an optimization of internal resource management is the place to look for ROI for this particular crisis.
Well, yes, Mel, the pips have been squeezed. I like that as a metaphor. I think we're trying, you know, the other one is trying to get blood from a stone. I think agencies are desperate to find ways to be able to be financially sustainable. But if you are being paid less to do more work, it is almost impossibly financially sustainable. So that's the first thing. There's your pips. Secondly, what I'm talking about is actually taking an approach where we start thinking about a client's requirements in a framework that allows us to focus our resources on the strategically and financially important projects for the client and find ways to optimize and improve the productivity in those areas where it's less strategically and financially important. And I'll give you a good example. We had a client that is now investing around 60% of their media budget on digital display advertising. And the agency they were using was still producing the 7 or 8 different standard sizes for those digital display ads manually on a Mac with a Mac operator, even though there are now quite a number of technology platforms that will almost automate that for you. And when we said to the agency, because the client was saying, we're producing so many, we want to get economies of scale, and the agency was going, but it takes so many hours to do the 7 different versions. And we asked the agency, why didn't they invest in bringing in one of these platforms to actually streamline the work? And I kid you not, they said, how could we possibly charge for that? Because we get paid by the hour. And if we put in one of these platforms, how can we then work out how to charge? Because it's basically, once you set up the project, it just spits out the results at the end. So this is the thinking we have at the moment, which is an input cost model, is actually stopping many agencies being able to innovate. Because if they move to a more automated system for some of this tier 3 work, they don't know how to charge for it.
So, Darren, is that a way of saying that actually there's opportunity, bizarrely here, for agencies in the change that we think is coming up to be paid for what they're good at and to automate what is more easily done? Can we go that far?
Well, look, and in fact, there's a big upside for this for agencies, because I was talking to a agency CEO in the US, and he was saying one of the big problems is their very large clients are starting to say things like, well, we'll just get you to do the tier 1 work, and we're going to take all of the tier 2 and they didn't use those terms. They said, we'll get you to do the big brand ad, But all of those implementation pieces, like, you know, the social media updates, we're going to get it done over here, either in our in-house agency or this cheaper agency over here, because we can't afford your big city New York prices. And when I took them through this process, they said, this is brilliant, because with that rate card, and if that was implemented across all of the agencies on that client's roster, they have as much chance of getting that work as the in-house agency or the cheap agency, because there is no financial impact. In fact, he saw it as he'd have a better chance, because he would also say that the creatives that came up with the idea would be able to oversee it if we managed the whole process. Rather than what's happening at the moment is the overall fee for the agencies either getting pushed down further and further, which we've seen, or they're carving off quite lucrative parts of the business from the main agency to give it to other agencies that can do it cheaper. Either way, this is a better solution for agencies that want to keep working, and also a discipline that they can bring to their clients.
Talking about discipline that this process brings to clients, Darren. So what typically do you see when you've implemented this? When we've implemented this across marketing teams, especially large marketing teams, what differences do you see or expect to see in terms of efficiency, responsibility, briefing, judging of work, that kind of stuff, making sure that they're not just, you know, sucking away at the kind of endless feed that a retainer brings you, that the all-you-can-eat retainer brings you?
Well, the first thing is, and it was when we were implementing this in South Korea, and the whole marketing team was there, and I was talking about the priority matrix, setting up brands for tier 1, 2, and 3. And I remember there was a brand manager, and the CMO, when they got their head around the idea, turned around and pointed to them and said, oh, so you'd be a tier 3 brand. And they felt mortified, because for that brand manager, this is their life. That brand is their life. To suddenly be categorized as a tier 3 brand was just, you know, such a confronting issue. First one. Second one is that a lot of marketers then say, well, I need to plan out my scope of work for the whole year so that I can work out which pieces will go into, you know, tier 1 and which would be tier 2. And no, once you've got this framework, you can actually use it on a project by project basis. So for instance, some global catastrophe happens, like we're going through at the moment. Someone runs into marketing and goes, we need to get a message out there as quickly as possible. You would then turn around and say, strategic importance, 3. Now it was high. But how much money have we got to do this? Are we going to invest? Is it going to give us a return on investment? So it might then end up being quite, you know, low as far as return on investment in financial terms, but it might be still strategically important from doing the right thing. So then you would decide if it's tier 1, 2, or 3, and then that would inform the amount of money that you would take from your budget somewhere else to cover this, if they're not adding extra budget to it, the type of agency that you would brief, the number of outputs, all of that would be in front of you and would be the conversation that you could have with your marketing team and then with the agencies that you're briefing, so that they're very clear about the level of investment and the level of strategic and financial importance placed upon this. So therefore the value that it represents to the company and to the brand or to marketing.
And of course, Darren, thinking about a tier 1 agency and the perennial complaint of a tier 1 agency where they can't afford to keep the most senior, experienced, talented people on board all the time. This allows for that to happen anywhere on an agency's portfolio of business, doesn't it? Because, you know, if you get it done quickly, if you get it done in 10 or 15% of the hours that actually were allocated in the output-based thinking, that's all just money straight back in your pocket, isn't it?
Well, it's funny because quite a number of agencies, when we've implemented this, have said, oh, so we'd put all of our expensive creatives and strategists on the tier 1 projects, and we'd put all the juniors on a tier 3. And I said, well, that seems like a very illogical approach. And they went, Why? And I said, well, in my experience, the most senior people are able to solve simple problems very quickly and very well. So in actual fact, you might be better having your juniors generating a whole lot of ideas on tier one because you've got the financial investment to do it, and have a senior team or the creative director overlooking it to get the best idea. But some of these tier two and tier three jobs could be done by senior teams that will go through it a lot faster and get it done much more efficiently and get the job done and collect the money and still do a great job. Tier 1, 2 and 3 is not about creative excellence. It's about strategic business importance and financial return on investment. Or it could be environment, as I said before, social responsibility importance or environment. Those filters that you build in there could be whatever is important to your organisation.
Great, thank you. So any other questions from the audience? Just pass those through as we come to the last few minutes of the webinar. Dan, so I've got one last question for you. So one of the things that I think is very sensible things that's being said through the commentariat in the last week or so is a crisis like the one we're in at the moment doesn't necessarily change things. It just brings the change that was already happening, brings that on more quickly and makes it more urgent. Would you agree here with the techniques that you've outlined here?
So I think this has been a trend that's been coming, and we have implemented it in the past, but we often find that people are more inclined to stick with what they know because they haven't hit the types of insurmountable problems that we're going to face in the next, let's say, 12 to 18 months. In the next 12 to 18 months, brands will be successful who can continue to have those dialogues, that communication with their customers. The thing is, will they have the resources, the financial resources to do it? Now, I don't think agencies are any longer in the position that they were in 2007, 2008. To take on the same amount of work for 30% or 40% less. Most agencies today, we just have to look at any of the publicly listed holding companies. They're reporting, if any growth at all, they're reporting 1 or 2%. Many independent private agencies are closing financially through this. These are businesses that are running often on the smell of an oily rag. Now, what we need to do is marketers need to find smarter ways of using that supply chain. And just cutting your budget doesn't mean that you'll be getting better value. It just means you'll be spending less money. So this is a framework and a discipline whose time has come, because we're going to see in the next 12 to 18 months, marketers struggling to find ways of being able to deliver and maximize the impact marketing has on building their businesses back out of this, but they're going to be limited in resources, especially financial resources. There is all the evidence that consumers, if they have money, are wanting to buy. But the businesses themselves are the ones that in most cases are suffering.
That's a great summary. Thanks, Darren. So I'll hand back to Julian to close up. Julian, are you online?
Certainly am. Next slide, please. Yeah, look, thank you everyone for joining the webinar, and thank you, Darren, and thank you, Nathan, for a lot of very insightful questions, and of course the questions from the audience too. Just wanted to say that in addition to this workshop, this webinar, we actually have a few others coming up. Next week, April 29th, in Australia, there's going to be Growing Your Independent Agencies in Challenging Times and Beyond. So please watch out for that one, register, and hope you enjoy that. Also, if you'd like to get the perspective on the unlocking performance post-lockdown from a different region, we're also going to be running this webinar in Switzerland and also in the UK. So you can see those coming up in May. So you have a chance to listen to how the questions change in different markets, as you know, though we're all witnessing and suffering impacts from COVID-19, the solutions and some of the thoughts may be a bit different. So the time zone may not be great for you, but have a look. And thank you once again for joining in, and stay safe going forward. So just a reminder, the recordings of this workshop, they'll be available soon. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do. And thank you again for joining.